Welcome to KrisFix-Germany. This is not a repair video. This should be a very short video showing you how to measure the perfect size thermal pads for your graphic card, because I saw so many damaged cards after thermal pads replacement is unbelievable. I can show you an example from this week. We received this graphic card with completely exploded GPU chip, and this was after changing the thermal pads. You can imagine what kind of damage you can do to your card, expensive card, with only thermal pads. So that's why it's very, very important to use the perfect size. What we need for that, we need the cooler, we need the PCB. We need also a reference point, 0.0. And this is for graphic cards, is always this surface right here on the GPU chip, the GPU crystal. This surface should always make a contact with the cooling surface on the cooler, always. There should be no gap between them. So in order to measure that, we need the height of the GPU chip from the PCB. So to measure that, I'm using a caliper, and we need the measurement from the PCB to the GPU chip, and this is roughly, so I cannot measure it so stable like that, but it's roughly 2.7. You can measure it very stable when you leave the card on the table and take a measurement from there, just like that. We have 2.65. If you're measuring like that, you can also you should add 0.1 millimeter to this measurement, so we're going to be around 2.7 millimeters, because we're measuring basically from the PCB to this surface here, but this surface and this surface here on the crystal, they are not flat, and this is almost always for every GPU is around 0.1 millimeters higher than this surface. For this model, for this gigabyte model, it's a little bit easier because we have on the cooler these spacers here, right here. This is where the screws are going in, and this, and the height of this spacer, the size of this spacer is exactly the same as the GPU height on the PCB, exactly the same. Because if the GPU chip is making a contact, is making a perfect contact with the cooler, this spacer also should sit perfectly on the PCB, no gaps there. This is the perfect size. So if I measure the spacer here from the cooling surface, we have 2.6 millimeters. So this measurement is our reference point, and I have created one table like this one where we can put our measurements. On the top we have the measurements for the cooler, in yellow in the middle we have for the PCB. These measurements are in millimeters, and on the bottom side the table should calculate for us the perfect size thermal pads. So I have already add here our measurements of 2.6 millimeter for the GPU, and also for the RAM chips 2.6 and 2.6, because this area here, this copper area, is completely flat. So there the surface area for the RAM chips is the same height. That's why I have entered the 2.6 millimeters there. In order to continue, we're going to the right side where I have capacitor, and this on the PCB is located right here, because we have the GPU, we have the RAM chips, and after that we have capacitor. To make this clear, we have capacitor, inductor, and after that we have the driver MOSFETs. The same thing is on the table, RAM chip, capacitor, inductor, driver MOSFET. All right, now let's take a look at the cooler. The cooler is right here. Up to here we have the RAM chips, and this area here is for the capacitors. we can measure from our reference point, which is this copper area, and we can measure the depth for the capacitors, and we have 7 millimeters. So let's go back to the table, and in this place for the capacitor measurement, we're going to type in equals to 2.6, our reference point, plus 7, and this make 9.6 millimeters. All right, to continue, we're going to measure from the capacitor area to the next component, which in this case is the area for the inductors. Here we're going to measure the depth there. We have 5 millimeters, so we have basically 5 millimeters from here to here. So, and we're going to our table for the inductor, and we are making this equal to our capacitor minus 5 millimeters. Minus because this surface here for the inductors is higher than the capacitor surface. That's why it's minus. So from the inductor surface, we are going to measure now this space between the inductor surface and the driver MOSFET surface. So let's do that. And we have 3 millimeters. Again, going back to the table for the driver MOSFET, again, this surface is higher than the inductor surface, and that's why we're going to make a minus 3 millimeters. All right, we're almost ready with the cooler. We're going to the left side now, and left side on the cooler is here. For me, is that here are the display ports and the HDMI ports. I'm also working like that. Again, this area here is for the capacitors, and we're going to measure from our reference point to there. We have 7.2 millimeters. Again, going on the table, equals our 0.0 minus 7.2 millimeters. I'm wrong, here is plus, because this is deeper than our area. And we have again 9.8. As you can see, this surface is not straight with this surface for the capacitors. There just a slight difference there from 0.2 millimeters approximately. And here we go for the inductors, which is the next component. We're measuring from the capacitor area to the inductor area. We have 5.1 millimeters, and this one is higher, so we are going here with minus. We're going for the capacitor measurement, minus 5.1 millimeters. 5.1. All right, and the last component is the driver MOSFET. From the inductor area to the driver MOSFET area is 3 millimeters exactly, and again this surface is higher, so we are going with minus. Here equals to the inductor measurement minus 3 millimeters. We have 1.7. This is all done with our cooler. I'm moving it to the side, and now we have the PCB. We're going to do the same exact measurements on the same components, and input the measurements in millimeters in our table. First, we need the height of the RAM chip from the PCB. Please be very careful when making this measurement, extremely careful. Choose a point on the PCB where are no other components. For example, I'm measuring here on this corner. As you can see, there are no so many components there. And for a reference, so I have now a measurement around 1.2 millimeters. I'm going also to measure one more RAM chip to make sure, to be sure, and here I have also 1.2 millimeters. So we are going back to the table. We are not going to do calculations here. We are going just to type the measurement. We have 1.2 millimeters on this side and also on this side, because they are the same RAM chips and the same height. The next component, we have the capacitors here, again measuring to the PCB, and we have exactly 8 millimeters. So we are going to type this in our table. We have 8 millimeters here, and let's also check this side here. They should be the same capacitors, but not all manufacturers are using the same capacitors, so double check everything before making a mistake. So the other side also 8 millimeters. Now we are going to the inductor area. We have measured the capacitors. We need the height of the inductor from the PCB. And the measurement is 4 millimeters. The inductors here are looking completely the same on the both sides. So I'm going to measure for a reference the other side as well. And I have 4 millimeters. Going to the table, inductor here 4, and also here 4 millimeters. The last component, what we have are the driver MOSFETs. So let's measure them as well. They should have the same measurement, roughly 0.9. And let's measure the other side also. And again 0.9. So I'm going back to the table and typing 0.9 on this side and also on this side. So here comes the calculation. What we need to do, as you can see here, I have typed this measurement minus this measurement, which gives me 0, because there should be no gap between the GPU chip and the cooler. This is always 0. This is perfect. 0 is okay. Here for the RAM chips we need equal the measurement from the cooler minus the measurement from the PCB, and we have 1.4. This is exactly the same on the other side, minus the measurement of the RAM chip 1.4. Let's go for this capacitor. Again, very simple, the same thing. We're going with minus 1.6. all right, and for the inductor minus this one 0.6, and here for the driver MOSFET 0.7. Let's go on this side. The measurements are completely the same here, so I will type it just like that for you, so you can have an idea. All right, now we have the perfect size. So now we have the exact space between our components and the surface area on the cooler. This is for the RAM chips, is 1.4 millimeters. So this means when the GPU chip makes a perfect contact with the cooler, the space between the cooler and the RAM chip is 1.4. In this situation, you can use 1.5 millimeters, but this is wrong. You need the thermal pad to squeeze between the component and the cooler. 1.4 is kind of difficult to decide what size of thermal pad to use here, and always so for this example you can take 2 millimeter soft, always soft. 2 millimeter soft is going to be the perfect thermal pad size. So let me show the screen a little bit more, just like that. 2 millimeter soft for the RAM chips is going to be the perfect size. Don't use hard thermal pads here, you can damage your board, because they cannot squeeze so much, they are hard, and you can damage the PCB, and also you can end up with a bad cooling for the GPU chip, because if you're using hard pads here on the RAM chips, they will increase the gap between the GPU chip and the cooler, and that's why your GPU will overheat for sure. Here for the capacitors on this side, we have a gap from 1.6 millimeters as usual. So we can take the same thermal pads, 2 millimeters soft. If we buy a thermal pads, you can buy just one soft pad and use it for the capacitors, for the RAM chips, and so on. We're going here for the inductors. We have gap from 0.6, and the inductors area, they are small components, they are not so big components. We can very safely here use 1 millimeter pad. It can be also soft. It's not a bad idea to be soft, but you can also use a little bit harder thermal pad here, is not a problem. Again, the same thing for the driver MOSFETs. We have a gap from 0.7 millimeters, and we can use the same thermal pad here, 1 millimeter and 1 millimeter. And also I can give you an idea how to measure the backplate. It's exactly the same with no difference. As you can see, these spacers here, they should make a contact with the PCB, and that's why if you measure the height of this spacer to the backplate surface, we have in this case 2.8 millimeters. So 2.8, let's leave the backplate on the side, take the PCB. Here on this 3080 Ti, we don't have a RAM chips on the backside, but if you have a RAM chips on the backside, you can use the same exact measurement like the front side. So you can take a measurement, we have here 1.2 millimeters height. You can take exactly the same, so 2.8 height from the spacer minus 1.2, we have 1.6 millimeter gap between the backplate and the RAM chip. For example, if this is 3090, so you can use on the RAM chips soft pads 2 millimeters. Here we don't have RAM chips, and we have a lot of capacitors here. If I want to place a thermal pads here behind the RAM chips, I can measure the height of one of the capacitors, which gives me 1 millimeter, and this space here is 2.8 minus 1 gives me exactly 1.8 millimeter gap. So very safely on the backside I can use 2 millimeter pads, soft or hard pads, it doesn't matter. It's not the difference is not so big. They should squeeze only 0.2 millimeters, which is okay. For the backside, I will take here a harder thermal pad. These measurements, I will say it one more time, can be done to every single graphic card. It doesn't matter. Only for reference, you can use my measurements here. For example, the height of the GPU chip from the PCB for all 3080, 3090, 3080 Ti's, 3090 Ti cards, and also I think for the 4080, 4090, this is the same height from the PCB. So you can use my measurement, 2.6 millimeters GPU height from the PCB. You can go safer and type 2.7, works also good, but as I said, you can use my measurements. Also for the RAM chips, they have the same height as well. They're using the same size solder balls, and also the RAM chips from Micron and Samsung GDDR6 and X, they have the same dimensions. So you can use also height here from 1.2 millimeters. And for these cards, you should only measure the capacitors, inductors, driver MOSFETs, and you're ready to go. Don't make a mistake and take a 5 minutes, measure everything. It's all simple. Thank you for watching. If you need a repair, check the links in the video description. We will see us in the next one. Bye.